The official narrative says that in the early 1800s, ambitious governments invested in infrastructure to encourage settlement and economic growth. Roads, canals, and civic buildings were constructed ahead of population arrival, a logical strategy for nation building. But in 1817, New York State began construction on the Erie Canal, a 363-mile waterway connecting the Hudson River to Lake Buffalo. The project cost $7 million, equivalent to roughly $170 million today. At the time, the total population of New York State was approximately 1.4 million people. The canal's route passed through regions where settlement was sparse, where towns didn't yet exist, where the demand for such infrastructure hadn't materialized. The canal opened in 1825. Within 15 years, grain shipments from the Midwest increased by 3,000%. Cities appeared along its banks. But the engineering had been completed before those cities formed, before those grain shipments existed, before the economic activity that would justify the expense had begun. The timing raises questions about the sequence. Before continuing, it's important to establish the nature of this examination. This is not a presentation of conspiracy theory. This is not an argument for suppressed history or hidden civilizations. This is an analysis of documented construction timelines, architectural patterns, and infrastructural decisions that, when viewed together, create friction with the standard explanation of how these systems came to exist. The evidence is real. The interpretations vary. The goal here is to examine what the records show, not to insist on a singular conclusion. The standard explanation holds that 19th-century governments were forward-thinking. They built infrastructure in anticipation of growth. They invested in the future. They took calculated risks that paid off. That explanation works in isolation. It becomes less stable when you examine the scale and the consistency. In 1811, New York City adopted the Commissioner's Plan, which laid out a street grid for Manhattan, 214 streets and 12 avenues. The plan extended far beyond the developed areas of the city. It platted streets through farmland, through rocky wilderness, through areas where no one lived. The grid wasn't completed all at once, but the vision was established decades before the population existed to fill it. By 1860, the population of Manhattan had grown to 814,000. The grid was there waiting. The streets had been surveyed, planned, and in many cases constructed, long before demand required them. In Washington, D.C., the L'Enfant Plan of 1791 designed a city for 800,000 people. At the time, the U.S. capital had fewer than 5,000 residents. The streets were laid in radial and grid patterns. Grand avenues were plotted. Public spaces were designated. The city wouldn't approach its planned capacity for more than a century. Why design for 800,000 when you have 5,000? In London, the 1848 Metropolitan Commission of Sewers authorized construction of a citywide sewer system, completed in the 1860s under Joseph Bazalgette. The system was engineered to serve a population of 4 million. London's population in 1860 was approximately 3 million. The system included 82 miles of main sewers and over 1,000 miles of street sewers. It was built with redundancy, with excess capacity, with margins that wouldn't be needed for decades. Bazalgette himself said the tunnels were sized larger than calculated needs. He doubled the diameter requirements. When asked why, he reportedly said, "Well, we're only going to do this once." The pragmatism makes sense. The scale still unsettles. In Philadelphia, the Fairmount Water Works was constructed between 1812 and 1815 to supply clean water to the city. The facility was designed with a capacity far exceeding the city's immediate population. The neoclassical architecture, Greek Revival columns, marble facades, suggested permanence and ambition on a level that seemed disproportionate for a city of 100,000 people. The works included a dam, reservoirs, pump houses, and distribution infrastructure. It became a model for other cities. But the engineering reflected expectations of a city much larger than the one that existed when construction began. Across the Atlantic in the same period, similar patterns emerged. In the 1820s and 1830s, Britain constructed railway lines into regions with minimal population. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, completed in 1830, connected two industrial cities, but the broader network expanded rapidly into rural areas where demand was speculative. Stations were built, bridges were engineered, tunnels were excavated, all before the communities that would use them had grown large enough to justify the expense. The Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in 1825, ran through sparsely populated countryside. It was the first public railway to use steam locomotives. It wasn't built in response to overwhelming demand. It was built in anticipation of it. In Russia, the construction of St. Petersburg under Peter the Great is often cited as an example of a city built by decree. But the infrastructure of the 19th century followed similar logic. Roads, bridges, administrative buildings appeared in regions where settlement was sparse. The systems preceded the populations. The consistency is what creates discomfort. One project might be visionary. A dozen projects might be good planning. But when you find this pattern repeating across continents, across decades, across governments with different political structures and economic systems, the explanation of forward-thinking investment begins to feel less like analysis and more like a default assumption. The infrastructure wasn't just oversized. It was also remarkably uniform in its execution. The architectural styles, neoclassical columns, symmetrical facades, grandiose public buildings, appeared simultaneously in cities that had little direct communication. The engineering standards for roads, canals, and rail systems showed surprising consistency, even across national borders. And the systems worked. From the moment they opened, the infrastructure functioned as if designed for the populations that would eventually arrive. There were no significant redesigns, no major corrections. The capacity was there, waiting. The question isn't whether these projects succeeded. They did. The question is whether the explanation of speculative investment fully accounts for the scale, the timing, and the coordination. Because if you accept that explanation, you must also accept that dozens of governments, across multiple continents, simultaneously decided to invest vast resources into infrastructure for populations that didn't yet exist, and that all of those gambles paid off. Or you must consider that the infrastructure wasn't built in anticipation. It was built for something that already. The United States offers the clearest view of the pattern because the timeline is compressed and the documentation is extensive. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. The new territory was largely unsettled by American colonists. There were indigenous populations, scattered French trading posts, and vast stretches of wilderness. The federal government now controlled 828,000 square miles of land with minimal infrastructure. Within 2 decades, that began to change. The National Road, authorized by Congress in 1806, was designed to connect the eastern states to the western frontier. Construction began in 1811. The road extended from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois, a distance of over 600 miles. Much of the route passed through regions where settlement was sparse or non-existent. The road wasn't paved in response to traffic. The traffic came after the road was built. By 1838, the National Road reached its western terminus. Towns appeared along its path. But the engineering decisions, the width of the roadbed, the grading standards, the stone bridges, had been made before those towns existed. The infrastructure anticipated the communities that would form around it. The Erie Canal followed the same logic but on a larger scale. When construction began in 1817, the canal route passed through the Montezuma swamps, through forests, through terrain that would require extensive excavation and engineering. The project employed thousands of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants. The work was brutal. Disease was common. The cost was staggering. But the canal wasn't built for the population that existed in 1817. It was built for the population that would exist in 1850. And that population arrived almost on schedule. Buffalo, at the western terminus of the canal, had a population of approximately 2,500 in 1825. By 1855, the population had grown to over 74,000. Rochester, along the canal route, grew from 1,500 residents in 1820 to over 36,000 by 1850. The canal created the cities. But the canal had been engineered before the cities existed. The same pattern repeated with the railroads. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, was designed to connect the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River. The route extended through the Allegheny Mountains, requiring tunnels, viaducts, and bridges. The first section opened in 1830. The full route to Wheeling, Virginia, wasn't completed until 1853. But the engineering standards, the gauge width, the bridge load capacities, the tunnel dimensions, were established in the 1830s, long before the freight volume existed to justify them. The B&O wasn't responding to demand. It was creating the conditions for demand to emerge. In Britain, the pattern was even more pronounced. The railway mania of the 1840s saw the construction of over 6,000 miles of railway track in less than a decade. Lines were built into rural areas, into regions with minimal population, into territories where economic activity was speculative at best. The London and Birmingham Railway, completed in 1838, included the Kilsby Tunnel, a 2,423-yard tunnel that required 5 years to construct and cost over £300,000. The engineering was extraordinary. The tunnel was lined with 36 million bricks. Ventilation shafts were sunk to depths of 130 feet. Why build a tunnel of that scale and permanence for a railway line that served a population barely large enough to fill the trains? The answer, according to the official narrative, is that the railway companies expected growth. They invested in infrastructure that would serve future demand. But the scale of the investment suggests something more than optimism. It suggests certainty. The Great Western Railway, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, opened in 1841. The line connected London to Bristol, a distance of 118 miles. Brunel designed the railway with a broad gauge of 7 feet, significantly wider than the standard gauge of 4 feet 5 inches used elsewhere. Brunel believed the broad gauge would allow for faster, smoother travel. He was right. But the decision required custom-built locomotives, custom-built carriages, and custom-built infrastructure. The investment was enormous, and it was made before the passenger volume existed to justify it. The railway succeeded. Within a decade, the Great Western Railway was one of the most profitable lines in Britain. But the infrastructure had been built in anticipation of that success, not in response to it. Storage infrastructure followed the same pattern. In the United States, grain elevators began appearing in the 1840s, particularly around the Great Lakes and along canal routes. These weren't small structures. They were massive, multi-story facilities designed to store hundreds of thousands of bushels of grain. The first steam-powered grain elevator was built in Buffalo in 1843. The facility could store 55,000 bushels of grain and could load or unload cargo at a rate of 1,000 bushels per hour. The engineering was sophisticated. The capacity was excessive for the grain trade that existed in 1843. But by 1850, Buffalo was handling over 8 million bushels of grain annually. The infrastructure had been built before the trade existed. In Chicago, grain elevators appeared in the 1850s, before the city had become a major agricultural hub. The elevators were engineered for a level of trade that wouldn't materialize for another decade. But when the trade arrived, the infrastructure was ready. The electrical grid followed the same logic, though on a later timeline. In the 1880s, Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station in New York City was designed to provide electricity to a small section of Lower Manhattan. The system included underground conduits, junction boxes, and distribution infrastructure. The capacity was far greater than the initial customer base required. By the 1890s, electrical systems were being installed in cities across the United States and Europe. The infrastructure, power plants, transmission lines, substations, was built before widespread electrification had occurred. The systems anticipated demand that hadn't yet materialized. In London, the first underground electric railway, the City and South London Railway, opened in 1890. The tunnels were deep-level bored tunnels, engineered with precision. The stations were designed with platforms, ticketing infrastructure, and ventilation systems. The ridership in the first year was modest. But the infrastructure was built for a city much larger than the one that existed in 1890. The coordination is what unsettles. Across continents, across decades, infrastructure appeared in advance of the populations that would use it. The engineering standards were consistent. The architectural styles were similar. The systems functioned immediately with minimal adjustment. Whether this reflects inheritance or convergence is a question that demands examination. Because the alternative, that governments across the world independently decided to invest vast resources into infrastructure for populations that didn't exist, and that all of those investments succeeded, requires a level of coordinated foresight that strains credibility. The administrative structures were also remarkably similar. Postal systems, census frameworks, land survey grids, all appeared in the early 19th century with a level of organization that seemed disproportionate to the populations they served. The U.S. Public Land Survey System, established in 1785, divided the Western territories into a grid of townships and sections. The grid was surveyed and platted before settlement occurred. The system imposed order on wilderness, creating a framework for communities that hadn't yet formed. In Canada, the Dominion Land Survey followed the same logic, creating a grid across the prairie provinces in the 1870s and 1880s. The grid anticipated settlement. The townships were platted before the towns existed. The systems worked, but the sequence, infrastructure first, population second, creates a tension that the official narrative struggles to resolve. Because if the infrastructure was built for populations that were expected to arrive, the builders must have possessed extraordinary confidence in their predictions. Or they were working from a template that already. The name Tartaria appears in European maps from the 16th through the 19th centuries. It referred to the vast territories of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe, regions largely unknown to Western cartographers. The term wasn't a specific empire or unified state. It was a geographic designation for areas beyond the familiar borders of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Tartary, as it was sometimes spelled, appeared on maps published by Mercator, Ortelius, and other influential cartographers. The borders were vague. The details were sparse. The label served as a placeholder for territories that European powers hadn't fully explored or documented. By the late 19th century, as exploration and colonial expansion filled in the blank spaces on the map, the term Tartaria gradually disappeared from cartographic use. It wasn't erased. It became obsolete. In the early 21st century, the term resurfaced in online communities examining historical architecture and infrastructure. The focus shifted from geography to chronology. Researchers began asking whether the infrastructure of the 19th century, particularly in North America, Europe, and Russia, could have been built in the time frames claimed by official records. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria is not monolithic. It encompasses a spectrum of perspectives, from academic curiosity to speculative history to outright alternative narratives. Some treat it as a metaphor for lost knowledge. Others propose it as a literal predecessor civilization. Still others use it as a framework for questioning accepted timelines. Three interpretation models have emerged from the evidence. The first model accepts the official narrative entirely. Governments in the 19th century were exceptionally forward-thinking. They invested in infrastructure ahead of demand as a strategy for encouraging settlement and economic growth. The gambles paid off. The consistency across regions reflects shared Enlightenment ideals, improved communication between nations, and the spread of engineering knowledge through academic networks and professional societies. The architectural uniformity reflects the dominance of neoclassical aesthetics. The over-engineered systems reflect prudent planning and Victorian confidence in progress. This model treats the evidence as proof of human ambition and successful long-term investment. The second model proposes inherited infrastructure. It suggests that some portion of the 19th century building stock, particularly large civic structures, canal systems, and urban grids, may have been inherited from an earlier period or predecessor culture, then repurposed and integrated into the expanding nations of the 1800s. This model doesn't require a lost empire. It requires only a revision of construction timelines and an acknowledgement that some structures attributed to the 19th century may have originated earlier. The model accounts for the scale and uniformity by proposing that builders were working within existing frameworks rather than creating them from scratch. This model treats the evidence as indication of chronological compression or misattribution. The third model rejects the standard timeline more comprehensively. It proposes that a widespread, technologically sophisticated civilization existed in the 18th or early 19th century and that its collapse or dissolution created a historical discontinuity. The infrastructure wasn't built for future populations. It was built for populations that already existed, then inherited by the nations that formed afterward. This model points to the architectural consistency, the engineering sophistication, and the apparent coordination as evidence of a unified or connected prior culture. This model treats the evidence as fragments of a disrupted historical record. None of these interpretations can be definitively proven with the available evidence. Each requires assumptions. Each has gaps. But all three models must contend with the same core observations. The infrastructure was overscaled, the timing was anticipatory, the coordination was extensive, and the systems functioned immediately. The year 1816 reappears in multiple contexts. It's known historically as the year without a summer. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815 ejected massive amounts of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, causing global temperature drops in 1816. Crops failed. Famine spread. Snow fell in June in New England. Frost damaged harvests across Europe. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. But by the 1820s, the infrastructure boom had begun. The National Road, the Erie Canal, the railway expansion, the urban planning projects, all commenced or accelerated in the decade following 1816. Whether this timing reflects recovery and rebuilding or simply coincidental economic expansion depends on which interpretation model you accept. If you accept the first model, the infrastructure boom was a response to post-crisis optimism and renewed investment in growth. If you accept the second model, the boom reflected the repair and reactivation of systems that had been damaged or abandoned during the crisis. If you accept the third model, the boom represented the reorganization of inherited infrastructure under new administrative frameworks following a civilizational disruption. The evidence doesn't favor one interpretation over the others. It simply exists, waiting for examination. The goal of this examination has never been to prove a conspiracy or expose a hidden truth. The goal has been to present documented patterns that create friction with accepted explanations. The infrastructure of the 19th century was built on a scale and with a consistency that demands explanation. Whether that explanation is exceptional foresight, inherited systems, or chronological revision is a question that each observer must answer based on their assessment of the evidence. The Tartaria framework, in its modern form, is less a claim about a specific lost empire and more a metaphor for the discomfort that arises when you examine the sequence of construction, the uniformity of design, and the excess of capacity. It's a way of naming the friction. The official narrative says that visionary governments built infrastructure for populations that hadn't yet arrived, and those populations arrived on schedule. That narrative may be entirely accurate. It may also be incomplete. The evidence invites examination. The patterns invite questions. The consistency invites skepticism, not of the structures themselves, but of the explanations offered for their existence. Because when you look at the canal systems of New York, the railway tunnels of Britain, the grain elevators of Chicago, the street grids of Manhattan, and the sewer systems of London, when you see them not as isolated projects but as part of a coordinated global pattern, you're left with a choice. You can accept that dozens of governments across multiple continents simultaneously invested vast resources into infrastructure for populations that didn't exist, and that all of those gambles succeeded. Or you can consider that the infrastructure wasn't built in anticipation. It was built for something that was already there. The interpretation is yours. The evidence remains. And the systems, centuries later, still function, designed with margins that suggest their builders knew exactly how much capacity would be needed, long before the need had arrived. The discomfort persists. The questions remain open. And the structures stand, waiting for us to decide what their existence truly means.